That summer, the Gregory family gathered at their old farmhouse in the Indiana countryside, a place that had once been home to 3 generations. The wind carried the scent of hay, and the sound of cicadas buzzed like a memory, trying to crawl back into the present. Cars lined the driveway, expensive ones, SUVs, sedans with leather interiors. Inside the house, laughter echoed, mixed with humble brags and thinly veiled competition. Who just got promoted? Who bought a new car? Who's closing on another property? Evan walked in last. No one noticed the soft creak of the door behind him. He wore a faded shirt, a sun-bleached backpack slung over one shoulder, and shoes worn thin at the heel. At 29, he didn't have a glittering career or a prestigious degree. He was simply different. Once a passionate art student forced to drop out when tuition got too high. Now he taught painting to children with disabilities at a local community center. And then, that look. Mr. Gregory, his father glanced at him, eyes cold and unreadable, just like always. No words, no hug, not even a handshake. Just a nod. Barely there. As if Evan was a stranger, not his son, not family, not blood. And that was just the beginning. Dinner that evening was served on a long wooden table, draped in a white, hand-embroidered cloth. The dishes were prepared from old family recipes, ones Grandma Eleanor had been cooking since dawn. The sound of glasses clinking filled the room. Conversations flowed, all orbiting around the success stories of the Gregory children. Sarah, the lawyer, newly nominated as assistant district attorney. Daniel, the cardiologist, just back from a major conference in Boston. And Matthew, lead engineer on a federal wind energy project. Mr. Gregory, hair neatly silvered and combed back, raised his glass of red wine, voice echoing proudly through the old kitchen. There were times as a father I wondered if I made the right choices. He began, his gaze sweeping across the table. But seeing you all here tonight, I know I did. I'm proud of each and every one of my children. He paused. His eyes stopped at Evan, the only one who hadn't spoken a word all evening, except that failure sitting over there. Silence. No one laughed. Forks froze midair. The air turned heavy, a strange, cruel stillness in the middle of summer. Evan looked at his father for a brief moment. His eyes held no anger. Just something breaking. Quietly. He stood. His chair scraped the wooden floor with an aching screech. And then he walked away without a word. Only Grandma Eleanor turned her head. Her eyes trembled as if she wanted to call out but didn't. Because deep down, she knew something had just died in her son's eyes. That night, Evan didn't return to the guest room. Instead, he chose to sleep out on the back porch, the same spot he used to escape to as a child every time he was shoved away from the dinner table, or from his own bed, just for making his father look bad. The thin blanket his mother had handed him before dinner still carried the scent of sunshine. Evan curled up his back against the old wooden post, listening to the soft chorus of crickets rustling in the grass below. A breeze slipped through the cracks in the roof, making him shiver. Not from the cold, but from the memories rushing back like a tide. He couldn't stop. He remembered being 10 years old, sketching his first portrait of his mother in pencil. The drawing was imperfect, but the eyes, her eyes were so gentle, so full of love that she'd wept when she saw it. But not Mr. Gregory. He held the paper for 3 seconds, then tore it down the middle right in front of little Evan's face. "Talent won't fill an empty stomach," he said, his voice colder than any winter wind. From that moment on, every time Evan picked up a pencil, his father would call it nonsense. Men fix machines, build houses. They don't waste time on pretty little pictures. Evan kept drawing in secret, in the corners of notebooks, in the shadows of the old tool shed. But that passion never died. Now lying on the porch of the old farmhouse, Evan stared up at the star-filled sky. He didn't cry. But deep in his chest, something felt stuck. Something that wouldn't swallow down. Not because of his father's words, but because, after all these years, he'd never once fought back. The wooden door creaked softly around midnight. Evan was still curled up on the porch, moonlight filtering through the branches of the old tree, above casting pale shadows across his face. Grandma Eleanor stepped out, carrying a small tray with a steaming cup of ginger tea and a light shawl draped over her shoulder. No words were exchanged. She set the tray down beside her son and sat next to him, as if she had sat there 100 times before. And maybe she really had. Evan didn't look at her. He only wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. The gentle scent of ginger drifted into the air, slowing their breathing. She didn't ask about dinner, didn't mention his father. She just sat, silent, still. Her shoulder resting lightly against his. A few minutes passed. Then she placed a small wooden box on his lap. The paint chipped. One corner cracked. Evan stared at it, brow furrowed slightly. He opened it slowly. Inside were old drawings he'd made as a child. Toby the dog, the backyard treehouse, his mother washing dishes at the kitchen sink. Sketches he thought had long been thrown away by his father. Tucked among them were school papers marked with phrases like, "very creative," "rare talent," signed by elementary school art teachers. Eleanor stared out into the night, her voice barely above the wind. "I know I couldn't protect you from all the harsh words, but I kept these, every drawing, every fragment of who you really are, because I knew. One day you'd need to remember you were never meaningless." Evan clutched the lid of the box. His chest tightened, not because of what was lost, but because someone had held onto the best parts of him, even when the whole family pretended they didn't exist. And that, in that quiet, sacred moment, it was enough to keep him from completely falling apart. The next afternoon, while the whole family gathered in the garden for a group photo, Evan stayed behind in the house, saying he needed to find some drawing paper for the kids. He wandered down to the storage room, a low-ceilinged space that smelled of mildew and old wood. A room he knew well. It was where he used to hide during punishments, and where he secretly taught himself to draw under the flicker of a yellow filament bulb. In the far corner sat a rickety wooden cabinet. At its base, buried under a thick layer of dust, was a silver-gray metal suitcase locked tight. Evan tugged at it. The lock was rusted, but after a few twists, it clicked open. And what he found made his heart stop. Inside was a large canvas wrapped in coarse burlap. The painting, though faded by time, was still vivid. A man stood by a lake, his back turned, bathed in slanted light. And in the corner, a signature G.F. Gregory, 1981. Evan's hands trembled as he lifted the canvas. Beneath it lay a yellowed envelope stamped in bold Gallery of Chicago, Solo Showcase Invitation. Inside, a formal letter invited Gregory Franklin Gregory to exhibit a solo collection. Tucked beneath it, a newspaper clipping from 1982. The headline read, "Show falls short, ambitious work, lacks depth," and at the very bottom, a medical booklet, handwritten diagnosis from a doctor. Severe physical and mental exhaustion due to chronic overwork. Immediate cessation of all artistic activity strongly recommended. Evan sank to the floor. His pulse pounded in his ears. All his life, his father had dismissed his past with a shrug. "I dabbled in painting. Didn't fit. Gave it up." But this wasn't dabbling. He had been an artist, invited to exhibit. He had dreamed big, and he had crashed not from lack of talent, but from a failure that broke him. Evan stared at the painting again, the bold strokes, the confident color blending. This wasn't the work of a man who tried. This was a man who once loved art and burned for it. And now Evan understood. His father didn't hate art. He hated himself for once trusting something that betrayed him, and he feared his son would fall in love with the very thing that had once destroyed him. The anger in Evan's chest began to soften. Not forgiveness, not yet. But for the first time he saw his father, not as a tyrant, but as a wounded soul still bleeding from a scar that never healed. Evan sat at the old dining table, the same spot where his father used to read the newspaper every morning. In front of him lay the unfinished painting signed Gregory, the man his father once was in 1981, and fragments of a life Evan never even knew he was missing. His fingers brushed lightly over the exhibition letter from Chicago. The curves of the signature still held the faint pride of a man who once dared to dream. But it had all ended. With a few cold lines in a medical file, a dream killed by exhaustion, by one failure, and no one there to help him stand back up. That afternoon, Evan brought the suitcase out back and sat beside his mother as she weeded along the garden fence. Eleanor looked up when she saw what he was holding. "I found this in the storage room," Evan said softly. He opened the box and handed her the painting and papers. She froze, her eyes locked onto Gregory's name on the canvas, then slowly scanned the letter, the article, the diagnosis. Tears welled up behind her glasses. "He never told me," she whispered. "He just said he used to have a small talent when he was young, but gave it up for something more stable. I thought he meant woodworking." Evan stayed quiet, his chest filled with something strange, something sharp, and soft at the same time. A part of him was angry that his father never spoke of this, that he projected all his disappointment onto his son. But beneath the anger, there was empathy. He understood now. Gregory didn't hate painting, didn't hate art. He once loved it enough to burn for it. But when that love failed to protect him, when it left him drained, broke, and ridiculed by critics, he locked it away. Like a man burying a child he never got to raise. And every time he saw Evan holding a paintbrush, his eyes weren't just critical, they were terrified. He saw himself again, young, too hopeful, and all in on something that offered no safety net. And Evan finally realized his father wasn't harsh out of hate, but out of fear. A fear so deep it bled into every word, every cold glance. Love, when shaped by old wounds, can sometimes cut deeper than hate. Gregory had loved the only way he knew how, by denial, by criticism, by saying no, over and over again. But now Evan knew, beneath every bitter word, was a man who once dared to dream and never got the chance to heal. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the old window panes and cast long shadows across the oak dining table, Evan walked in, carrying something large covered in burlap. The family was bustling with breakfast preparations, the clatter of silverware, the laughter of children, soft music drifting from the wall-mounted radio. And then everything stopped. Evan placed the item in the center of the table. Slowly, he pulled back the burlap. A large, unfinished painting was revealed. Yet it pulled every eye in the room. Bold brushstrokes, colors blended with purpose and restraint. Light rendered with the delicacy of a sunrise dancing across water. A lone man stood by a lake, his face turned toward the distance, unclear but full of quiet meaning. In the corner, G.F. Gregory, 1981. No one spoke. Sarah, the eldest, set down her coffee cup, eyes locked. Daniel squinted, stepping closer. Matthew leaned in, blinking as if trying to make sure it was real. Even the children froze. Grandma Eleanor, holding a plate of eggs, let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then Mr. Gregory entered, newspaper in hand. He stopped cold at the doorway. His eyes landed on the painting, and for a long moment he didn't move. His face, usually hard as wood, flickered with something else. Surprise, discomfort, regret. His feet seemed caught in memories that had never been spoken aloud. No one said a word. Evan didn't explain. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, facing his father, not bowing, not flinching. For the first time in his life, their eyes met, not in judgment, but in understanding. Mr. Gregory moved slowly toward the stairs, but as he passed Evan, he paused, his voice low, raspy, unsteady. Nothing like the sharp commands of years past. Evan, every head in the room turned. Thank you. 2 words, but they fell into the room like a bell in an empty cathedral, echoing, reverent, heavy with meaning. There was surprise in them. There was pain, and a kind of acknowledgement, not full, not polished, but realer than any praise in 30 years. He said no more, turned quietly, and climbed the stairs. His shoulders slightly drooped, his footsteps no longer certain. What remained was Evan standing between his father's unfinished painting, and a silence that for the first time felt like respect. No applause, no compliments, just this to finally be seen. In the days that followed, the Gregory household seemed to slow down by a beat. The proud chatter faded. So did the sidelong glances whenever Evan entered a room. Now, when he walked by, people fell quiet, not out of judgment, but because they no longer knew what to say to the son they once called different, who now held something deeper than all of them combined. On the second morning after that breakfast, Evan returned from a walk and found a small mahogany box sitting at his door. Inside were a few old paintbrushes, their bristles worn soft, a vintage set of watercolor pans, and a simple sticky note, still usable. No name, but Evan knew. The scent of varnish, the way the paper was folded. It was his father. Evan didn't say a word. He simply took the brushes one by one and began cleaning them carefully, as if he were wiping dust off a forgotten memory. The next afternoon, he opened his laptop in the living room to teach his virtual art class. One by one, the children appeared in Zoom squares, one drawing a cat with no ears, another struggling to finish coloring a butterfly. Evan guided them patiently. His voice was steady, warm, unhurried. Halfway through, he sensed someone behind him. He didn't turn around right away, but he knew. The heavy footsteps, the quiet breath in the still air. Mr. Gregory stood by the doorway, not leaning, not crossing his arms, just standing there holding a glass of water he hadn't touched. He watched the children on the screen, watched Evan teach not like a teacher, but like a man who'd once been extinguished and was now lighting others back up. They didn't speak, but Evan could feel it. His father's eyes were different now, no longer scrutinizing, no longer trapped between disappointment and pride. There was something gentler in them, softer, like a man trying to begin again, in silence, but truly. Early one late autumn morning, as the leaves began turning gold along the roads into town, Evan's phone rang. He was making coffee, hand-wrapped around a ceramic mug he'd painted himself, when his mother's voice came through the line, small, hoarse, shaken. "Evan, your father's in the hospital. He collapsed in his study last night. The doctors say it's not good." The mug slipped, shattered on the kitchen floor. Hot coffee spilled everywhere. 3 hours later, Evan stood in the hospital. The hallways glared with cold fluorescent light. The smell of antiseptic wrapped around him like a net. He passed room after room, his heart heavy in his chest. His mother met him on the 3rd floor, her face paler than usual. Her eyes red but dry, the kind of dry that comes after the tears are all used up. The doctors said his heart's been bad for years, she whispered. His liver, too. They think. It's all from overworking when he was young. He never got checkups, just said he was tired and went to bed. And now, Evan didn't need to hear the rest. He walked into the hospital room. His father lay there, thinner, pale, breathing through an oxygen mask, IV lines winding across his body like quiet warnings. But then Evan saw something that made him stop. In his father's hand was a small, worn piece of paper, crinkled, faded, corners bent from age. Evan recognized it immediately. It was a drawing one he thought had been lost forever, a picture of the two of them coloring together. He was 7 years old. It had been a winter afternoon, his very first paintbrush. His father, younger, then had sat beside him on the floor. They'd tried to sketch the backyard garden. It wasn't good art, but they'd laughed. A lot. And it was the only time Gregory ever held a brush with his son. Evan sat down quietly by the bed. His father's breath was labored, his eyes barely open, the lines around his mouth etched with a lifetime of exhaustion and things never said. Evan didn't cry. He gently took the drawing from his father's hand, then placed it carefully on his chest. But Gregory's fingers didn't fully let go. They clung just barely to the edge of the paper, as if releasing it would mean losing everything it held. Evan whispered, "I'm here, Dad. I'm not angry anymore. We don't have to say anything." And in that moment, something broke open. Not sadness, but something older. A weight that had pressed between them for 30 years. That wrinkled, half-finished drawing. It became the last word. A final apology, never spoken, but clear as day. And Evan knew without question, love, even when broken, even when misshapen, had always been there, just waiting to be seen. A week after the funeral, on a quiet afternoon, with soft rain tapping the windows, Evan's mother handed him a small envelope. She didn't say much, just placed it gently on the kitchen table beside the teapot, then turned away. Her eyes were still red. Inside was a folded piece of paper, creased, smudged with fingerprints. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but familiar. It was Gregory's, written most likely in his final days when he knew time was running out. "You're not a failure. I just didn't know how to love you right. Only you can finish this painting. I'm sorry." Evan read each line slowly, his vision blurred, though he hadn't noticed the tears falling. A short letter, just a few lines, but it hit like a thunderclap, shattering the ice he'd held in his chest for 20 years, all the pain he had buried, all the rejection, all the silence. It finally had a name, and so Evan wept, not out of regret, but because he was at last seen. That night, he hung the old drawing, the one he and his father had painted together, on the wall of his studio, still unfinished, still raw. A blank patch of paper remained untouched, uncolored, unshaped. He didn't add to it, because some things, even unfinished, don't need to be fixed. Some cracks are where the light gets in, and in that incomplete space, he found love, awkward, belated, imperfect, but real.